Let's get started on Chapter 15, Managing Active Directory Groups and Organizational Units. In this chapter, we will look at organizational units, at creating organizational units and adding users. We will look at using a batch file to create users and delegation. We will look at groups, permissions, and group nesting. As you know, Active Directory is a database of objects. And an object is defined as a record in the Active Directory database. Types of objects include user, computer, group, organizational unit, and printer objects. In the previous chapter, we talked about user and computer objects. In this chapter, we will look at group and organizational unit objects. Let's start out with organizational units. What's an organizational unit? Well, what's a folder on a hard disk? We look at a hard disk, we see that a hard disk is divided into folders. And the purpose of having folders on a hard disk is to group like files together. Similarly, the purpose of organizational units is to group like users and computers together. Organizational units are very similar to folders, whereas folders are used to group like files together. Organizational units are used to group like users and computers together. Three purposes of organizational units. One, to group like users together. A second purpose is to assign group policy objects to, which we will cover in the next chapter. The third purpose is the delegation of administrative permissions. You can use organizational units to delegate administrative permissions to. So let's go to creating organizational units. To create an organizational unit, we go into Server Manager to Active Directory Users and Computers. Under Server Manager, we select Tools, and under Tools, we select Active Directory Users and Computers. You can see that currently all users fall under the container called users. And if you had 10 or 20 users, it wouldn't be so bad. But if you had a couple hundred users or a couple thousand users, that would just be too many users to put in one container. So what we do is we create organizational units and put the users in organizational units. To create an organizational unit, we go to the root of the Active Directory domain, which in our case is ccbcmd.edu, and we select New, followed by Organizational Unit. I will give the organizational unit a name, such as Organizational Unit 1. I know that's not a very interesting name. It's the best I can come up with, followed by OK. Then I will right-click again on the domain and select New, followed by Organizational Unit. And I will call this organizational unit Organizational Unit 2, followed by OK. And I will create a third organizational unit, and I bet that you can guess what I am going to name this organizational unit. I will call it Organizational Unit 3, followed by OK. So now, instead of lumping all of my users together in the container called users, I will put some users in Organizational Unit 1, some in Organizational Unit 2, some users in Organizational Unit 3. I have just called my organizational units Organizational Unit 1 and Organizational Unit 2. But typically, what should an organizational unit be named? Well, organizational units can be named based upon function, such as the sales, marketing, or accounting organizational units, or organizational units could be named based upon their geographic location, such as Catonsville, Dundalk, or Essex. Now, let's look at adding users to an organizational unit. You can move users from the users container to organizational units, or you can create new users in an organizational unit. To create a new user, I will right-click on the organizational unit, select New, followed by User, and I will give the user a first name, such as Hank, and a last name, such as Aaron, and his login name will be Aaron, followed by next. I will give him a password, and I will confirm the password, and then I will click on next, click on finish, and you can see I have created a new user in this organizational unit. One way of creating users, as you know, is to use the graphical user interface. Another way of creating users is to use the command line using the ds-add, the Directory Services Add command. To create a user from the command prompt, I go to the command prompt and I type the command ds-add followed by user in close quotes cn for common name equal Jim, because that's the user's name, comma OU for organizational unit equals organizational unit 1, because that's where that user will be created, DC for domain component equals ccbcmd.edu, comma DC for domain component equal edu, close quote, dash pwd, and then in quotes the password that I'm going to assign to that user. I press the enter key and it creates the user called Jim. If I want to create another user in the same organizational unit, instead of retyping the entire thing, I just press the arrow key up once. If I press the arrow key up once, it brings back the same command that I previously typed. And then all I have to do is modify the name from Jim to Jeff. And now if I press the enter key, it will create a new user named Jeff in that organizational unit. And then now you can see in this organizational unit, those are the 3 users that I just created. Another way to make organizational units, to make users in an organizational unit, is to use a batch file. And when you create a batch file, several command line commands go into one file, and then all of those commands are executed at once as a batch. So here's how you would create a batch file. You would go to the command line and type notepad space batch1.bat. The name of the file is going to be called batch1. You can call it anything that you want. I just called it batch1. But it has to have an extension of .bat for batch file. I press the enter key and now I am looking at the empty batch file. Then I would type the first command line command that would go into this batch file, and it's the ds-add command that creates a user named Fred in organizational unit 1. Then I highlight this entire line and I paste it 5 additional times. And then I modify the user name to include Martin, Jane, Edward, etc. And then I save the file. And then when I exit the file, I can execute the file by typing batch1, and I press the enter key. It executes the batch file, and it runs all the lines in the batch file, and as you can see, it creates all of the usernames which were in the batch file. It's a much faster way to go than making users from the graphical user interface. So now you can see in organizational unit 1, I have created multiple users in organizational unit 1. The purpose of organizational units is to group like users together. First you create the organizational unit, then you create the users. You can create them one at a time using the graphical user interface, or you could use a batch file. And of course another thing you could do is you could take existing users and simply move them into this organizational unit. 3 purposes of organizational units: group like users together, to assign group policy to, and for delegation. So now let's look at organizational units for the purposes of delegating administrative permissions. In Active Directory delegation, if you add a user to the domain administrators group, then that person will have full power over every computer and every user in the entire domain. But if you just want to make somebody an administrator over one individual organizational unit, then what you can do is delegate privileges over a single organizational unit. In other words, you can make somebody an administrator over the entire domain, or you could make them an administrator over a single organizational unit. So to delegate control over a single organizational unit, we go into Active Directory, Users, and Computers. In Active Directory, Users, and Computers, I go to the organizational unit that I want to delegate permissions over, and I right-click and I select Delegate Control. In the Delegation of Control wizard, I can see that this wizard helps us to delegate control of Active Directory objects. You can grant users permissions to manage users, groups, computers, and organizational units. I click on Next. Then I will select the user who I want to make an administrator over this organizational unit. I click on Add, followed by Advanced, and I click on Find Now, and I could add a single user or I could add a group. In this case, I will just add a single user, followed by OK and OK. So Bob is going to have administrative privileges over organizational unit 1. Then I click on Next, and the question is what sort of administrative privileges do I want to give him? I could give him absolute full control over organizational unit 1, but maybe I just want to give him the privileges to reset user passwords. So if somebody loses his password, typically that user would come to you or me as the network administrators. But now that Bob has the power to reset passwords, now users can contact Bob and Bob can reset passwords. But in this example, the only power Bob has is to change passwords for all of the users in that organizational unit. But if I didn't want to give him limited powers, if I wanted to give him more power, I could then give him the power to create and delete and manage user objects. I could give him the power to create and delete and manage groups and group policy. I can give him just the power to reset passwords, or I can give him power to do everything. Then I click on Next. It shows we have chosen to delegate control over organizational unit 3 to the user called Bob. I click on Finish, and now we can see that I have given Bob full control over organizational unit 3. And now he can create and delete users in organizational unit 3, but not in organizational unit 1. Another way of performing Active Directory delegation is by selecting the organizational unit, selecting Properties, and then assigning permissions. Another way of making somebody an administrator over organizational unit 3 is to go to organizational unit 3, to right-click, and then to select Properties. Under Properties, we select Security. And I know it looks like NTFS permissions, but it's not NTFS permissions. It is Active Directory permissions. So I will click on Add, followed by Advanced, and Find Now, and I will make Sue an administrator over this organizational unit. I will click on OK and OK. Right now, she only has the read permission. But if I click on Full Control, now Sue has full administrative powers over all of the users in organizational unit 3, but no powers in organizational unit 1. And I click on OK. So you can see that in Active Directory delegation, you are assigning administrative privileges. You can assign administrative privileges over the entire domain or assign privileges to a particular organizational unit. Furthermore, you could give full control over that organizational unit, or if you wanted, you could give just the ability to reset passwords. Now, let's turn our attention to groups. Typically, groups are used to assign permissions. We add users to groups, and then we assign the group permissions. Why do we do that? So we don't have to assign permissions one user at a time, which can be awfully time-consuming. So here's what we do. I go to my organizational unit and I right click and I select new, and then I select group. So what I'm going to do is create a group and add users to the group. I will give the group a name such as the accounting group, and the group scope is what they call a global group, which is just another word for a group that holds users. And the group type it's a security group, meaning it's used for assigning permissions. It's not an email group. Then I click on OK. So now you can see I've created a new group called the accounting group. If I right-click on that group and select properties and select members, you can see that nobody is in the accounting group. So to add people to the accounting group, I click on Add, followed by Advanced, and I click on Find Now, and I select all the user or users who I want to be a member of the accounting group. Then I click on OK, and now you can see all these people are a member of the accounting group. After I have created a group and added people to the group, I would then assign permissions to the group, which is a review because I know that you know what permissions are. So here's what I do. I go to the Windows Explorer, not the Internet Explorer, the Windows Explorer, and I select the folder that I want to give permissions to. In this case, the payroll folder. I right-click and I select Properties, and I click on Edit, and I click on Add, followed by Advanced, and I click on Find Now, and I could assign permissions to a single user, but it's more efficient to assign permissions to a group. If I assign permissions to a group, then all the people who are in that group will get those permissions. Saves me the trouble of assigning permissions one user at a time. I click on OK and OK, and as you can see, they only have the read and the list and the execute permission. I will also give them the write permission, and that will allow them to edit and modify the contents of the payroll folder. I will click on OK and OK. So you can see that you create a group, you add a user to a group, and then you assign the group permissions. Now let's look at group nesting when we add groups to groups. If we have many users to assign permissions to, and if we have many groups to assign permissions to, instead of assigning the permissions one group at a time, we create a holding group. Then we add the user groups to the holding group, and then we assign permissions to the holding group. When we assign permissions to the holding group, then permissions will then be assigned to all the user groups that are a member of the holding group, and then permissions will also apply to all of the users who are a member of the groups that we have added to the holding group. Now here's a terminology issue here. User groups are called global groups, and a holding group is called a domain local group. The purpose of a domain local group is to group groups together. So users go into global groups go into domain local groups, and domain local groups get assigned permissions. Users go into global groups go into domain local groups get assigned permissions. A better word for domain local group might be a group holding group. So let's do it. I will go to Organizational Unit 1, and I will right-click and select New and select Group. But instead of selecting Global Group, I will select Domain Local Group. I will then give the group a name, such as the Payroll Group, followed by OK. If I right-click on the Payroll Group and look at Properties, I can see that nobody is currently a member of the Payroll Group. So I will click on Add, and I will add not users but groups. Then I will click on Advanced, then I will click on Find Now. And then I will add the accounting group, the bookkeepers group, and the managers group, and I'll click on OK and OK. So you can now see I've created a domain local group, and I have added groups to that group, and then I click on OK. And now what I'll do is I will assign permissions to the domain local group. So I will go to the folder that I want to assign permissions to, and I will right-click and select Properties. Then under Properties, I will click on Edit, followed by Add, followed by Advanced, followed by Find Now, and I will add the one payroll group, because remember, the groups are added to the payroll group. If I click on OK and OK, then by assigning permissions to the payroll group, that will also give permissions to all the groups that are a member of the payroll group, which will give permissions to all of the users, which are members of the groups, which are a member of the payroll group. I will also give that group the right permission. Click on OK and OK. So in group nesting, where we add groups to groups, it's the situation where we have not just many users, but we have many groups to assign permissions to. And instead of assigning the permissions one group at a time, we create a holding group. We add the user groups to the holding group, and we assign permissions to the holding group. And here's the terminology. The user group is called a global group, and the holding group is called a domain local group. Users go into global groups go into domain local groups, and domain local groups get assigned permissions. Users go into global groups go into domain local groups, and domain local groups get assigned permissions. The difference between groups and organizational units: groups are used to assign users permissions to data files. You add users to groups, you give them permissions. But organizational units are used to group like users together, to assign group policy objects to, which we will discuss in the next chapter, and they are used for the delegation of administrative permissions to Active Directory objects. In other words, you can give somebody administrative privileges over a single organizational unit. In summary, in this chapter we've talked about groups and organizational units. We looked at creating organizational units and adding users, and we also saw that you could use a batch file to create users. We looked at delegation and saw that you could assign somebody administrative privileges over a single organizational unit. Then we looked at groups and permissions. We looked at group nesting and saw that we could add groups to assign permissions. This concludes Chapter 15. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.